Welcome to CTO Insights, where we unpack the strategies behind high-performing engineering teams. I'm your host, Katerina, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Julien Lavigne du Cadet, a CTO with extensive experience scaling tech teams and products. In this episode, Julien shares his insights from scaling Zoe from early stage to 9-figure startup. We talk about the different challenges at different growth stages, balancing structure without overdoing it with processes, introducing platform teams, and process automation. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into creating high-performing teams and standout products. This episode is brought to you by Adiva, a global network of top developers connecting businesses with world-class talent. Whether you need to scale your team or bring an idea to life, Adiva empowers you to increase your engineering capacity without the overhead of traditional hiring. Visit adiva.it to learn more. Julien, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Katrina. It's fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me.
To kick it off, let's start with your journey, like leading a company from 0 to 9-figure ARR. That must have been quite a journey and quite some challenges underway. Can you tell us what you learned?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So to give a bit of context, so I used to be CTO of a company called Zoe, which is a nutrition health tech in the UK. And indeed, I joined at a time where there was no product, no revenue. So we're running medical studies. And based on that, we managed to build this kind of very successful product and very successful brand here in the UK and a bit in the US. And as you can imagine, as a technical leader, that meant having like a very small team at the beginning and growing that to a way larger team. The company went from about 30 people to 450 at peak. The tech team went from kind of 7 to 100. So I had the chance and the challenge associated with it of kind of growing this team and try to make it, as high performing as possible. And therefore, kind of my role changed so many times over the years. So it was very, very exciting.
We'll go into the details a bit later. And now, first, I want to focus on the foundations. And a lot of times, especially when a leader from a more established company joins a startup, they focus too much on the process at the beginning, on documenting everything. And more often than not, it just becomes a burden for the team. How could we balance this? What's the best way to approach it to stay lean at the beginning, but still, lay the foundation so that you could grow later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's actually something that I'm re-experiencing right now because I've joined a different company just a month ago called Lottie. And it's a way smaller company. And therefore, I'm also here to kind of put a bit of structure, but actually really to enable teams to go faster. And I think what you're describing, I think is very, very true. At least when I talk to other leaders, a lot of people kind of go through that. They kind of hire an exec from big company and they come very, very heavy with processes. And my approach to that is actually quite different. It's like, actually, can we almost kind of, relax some of the constraints? Sometimes those companies are not very mature. At Lottie, for example, there's a lot of fantastic things, but we have some processes that when I arrive, I'm like, this is processes that should be like for company like 5 times our size. And on the other hand, we've got things that are like quite missing. There is a big amount of work trying to find what matters or not. And the way I'm kind of thinking about it is that you can have like the best strategy in the world, but if you cannot execute, it does not matter. What do you need to put in place to have your tech team, your cross-functional team, hopefully, if not, that's something to tackle first. How can you get those cross-functional teams to go as fast as possible? And actually, if you go down to the basics, in general, you don't need that many things. I mean, obviously, you need to have like the right people and the skills, but you need to have the clarity as to what are you trying to build? What is your goal kind of next week, the week after? And sometimes this is kind of surprisingly absent in the sense you can either have like very big process, like, oh, let's do Scrum by the book and sprint planning and etc. The team members get lost in that because they just see like a list of tickets and they don't really understand, or a total absence of process where it's just like people kind of, picking something more or less randomly and without any kind of consistency. So can we just, come back to the basis and have like very clear kind of weekly goal, bi-weekly goal, where are we going, 3 months in the future? Like all the rest to some extent like matters a lot less. Like if you don't have that, then it's going to be very, very difficult. Do we know how to write software properly? Which like no process is going to help you do that. Obviously, there's lots of practices that help, but can you go back to the basis and like how do we iterate very fast on our code base? Those days even more with with AI. This is not going to be solved by having like a fantastic OKR process or anything of the sort. This is not going to be solved by having a growth framework. So you need to really go back to, hey, how do we kind of build software in very small increments so that we go fast, we learn. It's the fun of writing software as part of a high performing team to a large extent.
Nice. And now back to the challenges, different stages, different growth challenges. How did you deal with them? What were some, maybe if you remember, milestones or points in the company growth where you needed to switch the approach or to drastically change?
Yeah, so as a leader, some of the main inflection points you can think about is when you start adding layers. So, you may be at a point where actually everybody reports to you. So everything is simple, the information flow quite easily. And then you reach a point where maybe you have like 15 people in your team and you need to split into two. There's just no other way. Otherwise, you just cannot be everywhere. So you start having like team lead, managers, whatever you want to call them. And then suddenly you become a bit more removed from the day-to-day stuff. And like every time you had a layer, this is even more true. So you have your managers at first, and you can have like engineering directors, and now suddenly you have no idea what is happening on the day-to-day of a team. And every time that happens, you need to come up with like the good structures to start having the information flow back to you, the problems, and more importantly, once you've got the signal, how are you going to kind of influence the organization towards whatever you think is the most important thing that you need to do. So typical example is running product reviews. And so how do you get your teams to report on a regular basis the status, and then they come to you with what are the biggest problem or challenge that they have, or what are the options on the table, so that the senior leadership team can really provide input early and help steer the team in the right direction. So that's something to bring. Another very different aspect is that whenever you start scaling, especially when you start having managers, at some point you need to have this growth framework. You need to provide people with more clarity as to how do they grow in the organization, how will they become senior engineer, staff engineer, whatever you have in your own structure. And all the things are important. Personal experience is that a lot of people kind of oscillate between bringing those like super late and it's like total chaos, or actually sometimes too early. And I would say kind of the nice spot is that you want to feel the pain before you introduce those things, but obviously not too much pain. You should not go like toward chaos, but do not bring those things too early. Like let the organization actually feel the problem before you start introducing any of those things. And for example, you can very much go in a similar direction with like when is the right time to build a platform team. Definitely not on day one. Have like very much kind of product engineering teams, and then at some point you have like 2-3 teams, and they start like doing the same thing over and over again. And maybe they contribute in some kind of guild or community or practice, but you can feel that it's becoming harder and harder, that you need to put the responsibility on someone. Well, at this point, it's probably the right time to hire just one person. Maybe the platform team will be one person, not 4, not 5, and kind of iterate from there. So at least that's kind of the approach I will always take on towards building and structuring the org.
I love it. And it's completely focused on not solving problems you don't have, right? So you just wait for it to become a problem, and maybe it never even becomes a problem to be solved.
Correct. And like maybe an interesting anecdote is when I joined Zoe, so the company was 2 years old or something like that. We had exactly like one monolithic piece of software running on the back end. And I joined, and there is a project to deploy that piece of software on Kubernetes. And I was like, why on earth do we need to introduce Kubernetes at this point in time? Like in the grand scheme of everything we could do, this is not the priority. So we were kind of trying to anticipate for this world of kind of microservices and etc. And don't get me wrong, I love Kubernetes. It's a fantastic technology, and eventually we're very happy to have it. But that was just not the biggest problem, and not what we should have focused on at first.
You mentioned the platform team, and I want to go there because it kind of touches on what you were talking about right now. So both hiring and promoting from within, like you mentioned, the growth of the engineers and the rest of the team, and then creating the layers within the company. What was your strategy there? Did you focus on, growing the team, the engineers that you had, into managers, or did you want to hire more externally?
So I think this is something that is extremely contextual to what is your starting point, and what is accessible to you as a leader at the beginning or not. I'll give you quite different examples. Before Zoe, I was actually an engineering manager in a hedge fund in London. And eventually kind of all the people I promoted below me to being engineering manager themselves, I mean, all the people that ended up reporting to me were all promoted internally. There was like 0 external hires. And what made that possible was that we had a very high bar. Like everybody knew what great looks like. Therefore, it was a lot easier to kind of get the individual contributors to become the engineering managers because like the standard was at the right level and therefore they were kind of getting ready. If you have like more kind of diversity in terms of talent and skills in your company, it's going to be harder to kind of promote the people internally because people will have a harder time understanding what are the expectations, what is great, what they may not have seen what is great outside. And so at this point, it's interesting to start bringing some people from the outside because actually those people will help you raise the bar because you cannot be everywhere. So it's at Zoe, we had actually quite a balanced view of that. We promoted internally, we've hired some people from the outside that came up with some great idea, both at the engineering manager side and both at the engineering director level. It was a mix and it was like a really, really good mix in the sense we really had some people that brought so much to the organization. It would have been like nearly impossible to have this degree of talent density by just promoting from the inside.
And in terms of the team velocity, and you mentioned introducing the platform team. When we spoke initially, you also said that you had a separate analytics team, but that came later on, not at the beginnings as well, because everything was dispersed between the various teams at the company. How do you structure this properly so that the team is productive at every stage of the way? When is the right time to introduce separate teams or hire new people or focus on different areas, maybe developer experience and things that should bring more results later on?
So the way I like to think about that is that something needs to be standardized, and one way or another you need to make that happen. And at some point just having this kind of distributed into each of the kind of product engineering team is just becoming too hard. For example, my approach to building platform is very similar to what I think Netflix called like the golden path or the paved road, which is you want people to fall into the pit of success. Whatever is the thing that they're going to do is the right thing, like at least 95% of the time. So they don't need to think too much about it. It's like, oh, we need to create a new service. Well, there is a template for that. And that template comes up with like everything that you will ever require for at least getting the basics right. Like there's going to be authentication, there's going to be observability, like there's going to be like a standard dashboard where you can see whatever metrics from your service. And like you do not reinvent the wheel. You can build some of that easily at first when you're not too big with just having different people kind of coordinating across teams. At some point, your organization become too big. Those people are always kind of going to err towards kind of building feature for the domain they maintain with their teams, and this just become too much tension. So at this point, it starts to make sense to bring some expertise, and more importantly, to kind of regroup the ownership of that into a small team. This team should be very product minded, but like towards the rest of the engineering organization, because that's a very classical failure scenario that I've experienced myself, where sometimes you've got a team like this that just start building a platform just for the sake of building platform. They don't even know what problem they're solving. They think they're solving a problem, but definitely not everyone else's problem in the organization. So they should be very, very product minded, really build the platform as a product, which is an interesting, there's an interesting tension because the people that tend to be also very much building platform, they're not necessarily always the more kind of product minded. So you need to find the right leader for this part of the organization. But yeah, as I said, at some point it just start to break. It's very obvious. And the cost of not solving that problem means that everybody diverge, and it becomes incredibly difficult to go from one team to another to understand the state of the system, because everything starts to be very, very, very different. So suddenly your engineers, they do not want to move into this other team because they feel that there's going to be like too much pain, too many things to learn. Or sometimes this other team is just going to have like so different approach to everything that it becomes, I'm a bit afraid of what I'm going to find out, whereas I'm kind of quite comfortable. And you find yourself like solving problems are actually not very important for your growth and product market fit, such as, hey, we're building the platform versus actually building a product. So for me, this is kind of really the state you want to avoid And therefore, there's always a tension because you don't want to build everything, but you need to constantly iterate in that platform and at some point have some people. But to give maybe an idea of the ratios, I think at Zoe, at peak, we had maybe 4 or 5 people building the platform, including the security, for about 100 people in all of the technology, so engineering, machine learning, and data analytics group. So it's like a small percentage, like it's not like 10 or 20% like I've seen in some place. Analytics is slightly different in the sense, everything I've said you can try to apply to analytics, but the one big caveat with analytics is that one of the worst things that can happen to your business is having every single department have different numbers. So the classical problem is like, oh, how many sales did we do yesterday? And then you go next to operation, to marketing, to engineering. Everybody tells you like a number that is plus or minus 10%. What happens then is that no senior leader believe any of the numbers, and it's becoming also kind of chaos. So that's one of the things where you want to be very, very strict in one way or another about what is the source of truth and have like a very clean data warehouse. What I have found is that if you do not centralize the analytics team under one leader, if it's just like totally distributed and people just kind of coordinate, there is no forcing function for that. And each of the leader, they have their own number. They're okay. It's only when all the kind of leaders kind of gather and like the CEO or someone else start asking questions that you can start seeing the chaos erupting. It's like, I don't understand. Did we do like 1,000 sales or 900 sales yesterday? Because it's not exactly the same. So that I think we did very late at Zoe. And that was like a mistake. And the second we actually started centralizing, had like a whole category of problem that just disappeared. And I really felt it was significantly better. And those people can still be kind of detached in different teams, right? That doesn't mean they're just like by themselves in a centralized team, but at least they have this one leader they report to that just kind of ensure the consistency.
Are there any other strategies, structures that you've implemented to ensure that the team keeps the agility as they grow and stays productive and keep the velocity at some consistent level?
So my deep conviction that I developed over time is that there are actually very different models that can work. And sometimes people are very much, there's just one way and no other way. And I'll give you a quite extreme example from earlier in my career where we did something that I used to call continuous reteaming, where every quarter we were putting 50 engineers in a big room and we're like, these are the priorities for the quarter, go and figure it out. And go and figure out meant literally go and reassemble teams to achieve the goal. And what was happening in practice is that there was some stability in the teams because most of the priorities were kind of continuation of what we were doing before. So it was not like, it's like this totally new things. But sometimes there were some projects that were just actually fundamentally different. And so we needed to kind of extract people from different teams to make that happen. But more often than not, the solution that the group of people was finding was actually quite different from the solution I would have thought about, because suddenly they could start thinking about a lot more things than I could. So, who has the domain expertise? One thing, how do we balance the team in terms of kind of seniority? That's probably a thing I would have thought about. What do people want to do is another one. How do they want to kind of grow their skill? When you're doing that at scale, like 50 people, it becomes like impossible to all this information in your brain. And one of the things that is the most fascinating that I found actually when we're doing this exercise is that some people would start with, there is no way I would work on X because whatever reason, it's like, a crappy piece of software. I don't want to touch it, etc. And then at the end of the day, they were like, actually, I've self-selected and I'm going to work on X. Why am I going to work on X? Because I realized this is the biggest problem for the company. And actually, I hate this piece of software and I'm going to make it disappear by kind of writing a new thing. There would have been no way this would have been like a successful conversation between me and that person if I were kind of trying to move them. So where I'm going with that, I'm not saying people should necessarily do that. I believe there are some contexts where it can work, some contexts where it would not work. But what I found is that sometimes like people have like very strict ideas about what great look like, such as our team needs to be stable for the next 2 years. We should never change a team. I'm like, maybe not. What I found are the things that really, really help is like having a very, very clear direction as to where you're going. You can take like a very high performing team, but if they've got like 5 stakeholders kind of pulling them in different direction, in my experience, not much can happen. And so that definitely matters. You need the skills in the team. You need kind of the right level of motivation. You need people to really focus on, have this very simple rule for teams is like on Monday morning, think about what would great look like next Friday. Like I don't care about your long list of tickets, but tell me what would make a fantastic week? And you should be able to give me like one sentence, ideally. And if you do that, then suddenly you have like a high degree of self-organization where people just jump in to try to help each other. And all the rest, to a large extent, matters a lot less. And you can see that, for example, happening in hackathon, like team just assemble just out of like random people. More often than not, it works because they have the clarity as to what they want to build. And then the other thing is kind of iterate on your processes. And so don't just take whatever is there and accept it as it has to be that way, but just keep improving, keep thinking about what can be better. If you improve like 1% or 2% every week, it compounds very, very, very fast.
I love this. It's not so conventional. And I guess that's what makes it working, for your context and for just keeping the teams agile as the company grows, because it's difficult to do that if you have a fixed structure. In terms of scaling challenges, scaling the team, hiring new people, what were the main challenges that you faced with as the team grew? And also, how did you solve them?
So in the grand scheme of everything that went well and everything we could do better at Zoe, I would say we managed to ride that wave reasonably well. And part of it was very early on when I joined, really kind of increased the bar in terms of what people were hiring and how we were testing the people. So our interview process became very standardized pretty much on the day one when I joined. This is what we want to do. At first, I was doing every interview from screen to coding to system design to behavioral, not because I wanted to, but because basically I was bringing people in the call with me. They were shadowing me, and this is what I want, right? And on some of the things, like very quickly, I kind of extracted myself, but it was like a very important part of the process to make sure that we were relying on what great looked like. And so we had this process where basically you could not become an interviewer without shadowing and reverse shadowing. And so, for example, that's one of the things that we did, I would say, kind of reasonably well, that helped us having the right people in the organization. The other thing we did, which was a deliberate choice that not everybody has to do the same choice, is that we hired, we indexed very, very high for product-minded people, for people that were fundamentally quite passionate about our mission. And we kind of structured also the rest of the organization around that. So maybe we had slightly less technical people than some other organization, but at least we kind of optimize for, we want those kind of team spot, whatever we want to call it, to really understand what they're working towards, and like very high collaboration with the PM and designer. And another thing was perfect, of course. But I would say that is something that worked well. And then when you scale the organization, a big part of the challenge is like, how do you keep the standard kind of consistent across teams? So, if you look at big tech, it's quite standard what everybody is doing, but you need to have your performance review, you need to have like calibration. Performance reviews may be something where my views over time kind of evolve from, maybe, I don't know if it's one extreme for another, but in particular, everything that is related to growth framework, I went from, hey, it needs to be quite detailed, to now I'm more like towards actually a lot less details are necessary, because with all the positive intent in the world about how we're going to provide what great look like on all those kind of micro things, you always end up with massive amount of gaps. And I found that actually what you're really looking for is a mindset and not like a very, very specific set of skills. So that's something where maybe we were indexing too high on one side. I'm now maybe on the other side of the spectrum, and then I'm sure I'm going to do the pendulum and be somewhere in the middle in the next few years. But yeah, everything that is related to calibration and having your engineering managers like really discuss what makes a great engineer. How do you make sure that the great engineer on the right side is equivalent to great engineer on the left-hand side really matters a lot, because otherwise you start to have like this kind of subcultures that develop, and that's just not good at all. And maybe another thing that I found always super interesting for scaling is like being very, very deliberate about your system of work. How do you want people to work together? I'm in general very flexible about how a team work inside, but how team interface with each other is where I have like quite strong opinions. It's like, APIs versus kind of the internal of service. The internal of service can be written in whatever programming language. It's going to be, totally abstract to the rest. But actually the interface, we do care about it. And that's another thing where whenever you kind of scale your organization, you need to put a lot of thoughts into it. And a lot of leaders are probably not spending enough time designing the system.
There's one thing that you mentioned, aligning on what great looks like. And I also noticed it before when you were talking about what every team member should think about, like what would great look like at the end of the week. And I just love it, how it inspires people to focus on this is the standard, this is what we want to achieve, and everyone is on the same page.
Yeah, absolutely. And like for me, it's all about inspiration. It's like the ability to tell you at the end of the week, we've done that thing. It's amazing. And I like to tell my team, this is your internal goal. You don't need to necessarily kind of communicate it to the outside. It's like, it's not necessarily like a commitment that, if you don't make it, something's bad is going to happen. Just be ambitious. Like, try to stretch yourself. Try to make the thing that really matters happen. Like, no one cares about the 62 tickets that you've, shipped this week. This is not how we measure progress. Yeah, for me, it's just important to have always this kind of thing in front of me. Like, if we achieve that, then I deserve a nice glass of wine.
That's amazing. Let's talk a bit about automating. You mentioned when we were discussing before this podcast, customer support, scaling it, improving the product so that customer issues are reduced, and it could improve the self-service of the product itself. How could all of this support the team performance? How could it release the team from a lot of unnecessary challenges they're facing daily?
Yeah, so this is something where I felt there was kind of a lot of tension at Zoe in terms of what do we think is the right approach. And maybe going back a bit in the past, I think that the tension is coming from, do you want to have like all your technology, engineering, product capabilities very much kind of geared towards everything you need to do to find product market fit? Or do you want them to work more on kind of efficiency? And by making, for example, customer support way more efficient, actually you kind of create more capacity for yourself down the line. And it is fundamentally a conversation about what kind of time horizon are you optimizing for? Because if you're very much optimizing for the short term, you forget entirely about efficiency. Just let's try to find more product market fit. We'll do the tickets, we'll do the support. If you're optimizing for the very long term, you realize that over time, more and more of your capacity just goes into this kind of black hole of customer support, at least if your business scale. And maybe this is kind of the inflection point, which is if your business does not scale, then you should probably not worry too much about doing customer support kind of improvements. But as you say, there's many different ways you can tackle the problem. In an ideal world, your product is so great that no one will ever need customer support. But there's such a long tail of problem that actually it's not very practical unless your product is extremely simple. So if it is, fantastic, good job. We were not in that world at Zoe, in particular because our product was a mix of digital app, so mobile app that you interact with, and physical products. So we were asking people to wear a CGM, continuous glucose monitor, which is a device you put on your arm to measure blood glucose. So many things that could go wrong here. Another part, for example, is that we're asking people to eat cookies. Like we literally had this question one day in customer support from someone. The question was, so should I remove the packaging before the cookies, yes or no? And like, that sounds very obvious what the answer is. And still you have some people asking you that. But that's a fantastic example of the long tail. Like, okay, you can put that in your FAQ. No one will read your FAQ about whether you should remove the cookies from that. So maybe you could have a better product where we say explicitly remove the cookie from the packaging. Probably we did. I don't remember. Probably we did not put it like with a big red cross that this is something people should be aware of. But I guess my point is that you just end up spending ages trying to optimize those edge cases. And so you have to be quite deliberate about what's okay or not okay. Obviously, in recent years, what we're able to do and a lot of companies are doing is automate a lot more kind of the customer support side with a product like Intercom that provide AI agents and kind of answer some of those questions automatically for you. But even there, at least in the case of Zoe, there are quite serious limitation because in my case of cookies, we really don't want the model to hallucinate and say, oh yeah, that's fine, just go and eat the packaging. So there was kind of always some big trade-off here. Like the starting point for those things is very obvious, is like, can you measure it? And I think this is something where we're quite late to the party, in particular because the tooling we were using for customer support was actually making measuring all that stuff extremely hard. And so if you can actually understand where you spend your time, you can start being more deliberate about it. But I do think we've made a mistake in the sense we should have done a lot more kind of early on, because going back to your question, if you wait too much, and especially when you start scaling, that means you just have like a constant streams of problems you need to deal with, and your customer support team is probably not capable of kind of self-serving all of that themselves. So at some point, some of that kind of reach your engineering team, and you find yourself 10-20% of your bandwidth just doing things that are not adding significant value to the business. So you need to try to course correct quite fast. Or some companies have pretty much a policy was like, oh no, we're just gonna never end up in this situation, automate everything from the beginning, which I think is fine if you got very, very strong product market fit from the very beginning. If you don't, it's quite risky, I would say.
Did you do any product changes that majorly impacted reducing the customer issues and customer support tickets?
We did over time, many of those. I mean, funnily, one that I can remember was not a change on the digital experience, was a change on the physical experience. But it's actually quite interesting to think about it. So one of the things we're asking people to do is like take a small blood sample. And the way we're doing that is doing some kind of finger prick where you have to pick with a needle your fingers. And this goes wrong so many times. People just really struggle with that. It's actually quite hard to get blood flowing in your hands for a big category of the population. And so people just kept coming back. It's it does not work. What do we do? And for us, we had tons of software on the kind of fulfillment and logistics side to kind of resend whatever was necessary to redo the test. And then actually we did work with another company that was doing some R&D where they started building a device that you were, same thing, kind of putting into your arm. It was just kind of sucking the blood. And suddenly we had a lot less people complaining about that because it was just a lot more kind of smooth. Maybe my point here is that sometimes, not always, thanks God, but sometimes you need to be quite creative and actually solve the problem, not just the immediate problem in front of you, but actually go back to, is there a fundamentally better way to tackle this? And we had an operation teams that kind of led this project, did fantastic work. And that really kind of helped in one part of the experience, I would say.
That's amazing. Looking back, are there any decisions you'd approach differently? Any mistakes that you can recall that you would definitely fix if you were in the same position again?
So the way I think about that is that I'm never going to be 100% correct. And actually, a lot of things we're just going to try, see what happens and iterate. I think you need to be, there's one-way door, two-way door decisions. One-way door, you want to be super cautious about them. Two-way door, I would default towards acting fast and then assess and change your direction. But maybe the things where we struggle the most of the time is that with all kind of positive intent in the world, it's quite difficult to not end up in a situation where there's just so much work in progress. People are pulling in so many directions and you don't have the good systems in place to just very quickly go back to, this is the only thing that we do. And I think at Zoe in particular, we had a setup of kind of two co-founders and no kind of real tiebreaker for many years. And I remember pretty much on first months when I joined, it's this is the thing that's going to be hard. And yes, this was the thing that was going to be, that ended up being quite hard. So I think for me, maybe the big takeaway, the big things I would like to do differently, and I'm trying to do differently today, is just be a lot more strict with all the thing in the sense, just go at the root, kill stuff as quickly as possible. Let's not work on this. Let's be super clear. Basically, even more than I was probably saying no. And more importantly, really teaching everybody at every level of the organization to say no. We're focusing on that. This is the thing that matters. Sure, we're going to spend 20% of our time always, whatever, doing bug fix and small thing. That's fine. But let's agree on what's the right percentage. And let's stop being dragged constantly in conversations about things that do not matter. And I think all the companies are scaling very, very well, are probably very, very good at that. And then a lot of companies just really struggle, and you can feel it in the overall velocity of the organization.
I love it. Thank you, Julien. It was a great pleasure to talk to you today, and you've shared some amazing insights. I hope everyone takes away some interesting findings from all of this.
Thank you, Katerina. It was great to be here. Thank you for the great questions, and speak to you soon.
CTO Insights is brought to you by Adiva. To learn more about how we support innovative tech teams, visit adiva.it. Don't forget to subscribe to CTO Insights on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.